Weaving Your Social Fabric. I'm pleased to welcome Milton Friesen. Milton is with the Cardis Institute, and he will be sharing with us his content, and then we are going to have a conversation about network mapping and how you can use it as an effective tool for both identifying and also engaging untapped potential within your community's social networks. Milton is a senior fellow and program director of social cities at Cardis, which is a North American think tank. He has served as an elected municipal official, and his current work, he's also currently working at the University of Waterloo School of Planning, where his work involves a new proposal for measuring social impact. His work on network science applications for planning includes participation in Waterloo's Institute on Complexity and Innovation, and his paper, Social Infrastructure Underpinning the Success of Cities, explores the patterns of relationship we have with each other as individuals and groups. And he actually suggests in that article that paying attention to a city's social infrastructure will determine the long-term viability of the places where we live. And that paper was published widely distributed by Municipal World. So welcome, Milton. Thank you so much for your generosity in sharing your time today.
Well, thank you, Sylvia, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation. I think there's a lot of reasons to be interested in what's happening within the social space. A few maybe caveats as we start. First of all, the purpose of this is to give you something that you can use in your own work, in your own context. So the presentation and the worksheets that follow it are designed to be used by you. You're free to make use of them and use them in your own team settings. In that sense, you might consider this presentation a kind of a draft run of your own, and something you can then carry forward and make use of. And you'll also have a chance, as we look through the worksheets, to, in a practical sense, actually start thinking about and mapping some of your own networks, whether those were with people, individuals, or with institutions and organizations. I think it's quite important to also to recognize that, within the range of people interested in social networks, that it ranges all the way from the very technical sort of computer-driven analysis and mathematics all the way to a much more pragmatic level. And in today's presentation, we'll slant more towards the pragmatic application, and questions about more technical things. You can send them on the message board. The social fabric of our communities is really built out of the networks of relationships that we have with each other. And these happen at all different scales, from two people meeting together all the way to large organizations interacting within themselves and with the society around them. And really today we're going to, I'm going to introduce ways of thinking about this. We hear about social networks a lot, and this is a tool and a means of thinking about networks so that people in community development roles, organizational leadership roles, people in service delivery roles have a means of enriching their thinking about what they already know and adding to it some specific things that can hopefully allow them to improve their decision making, see opportunities that maybe they didn't see before, or further emphasize the opportunities that are going well. So we're going to walk through these next deck of slides and ideas with all of those sorts of pieces in mind. If you look at this first image we have, I've got a piece of string sitting there and not doing much at all. But string really becomes quite interesting when we start weaving the pieces together. So if we put things, two pieces of string together, and we keep adding more and crisscross and interact, we can make all sorts of useful things, from baskets to doormats or placemats. If you take this approach to kind of putting things together, a simple thing like a string or a piece of grass or something like that can be brought together with other pieces related in a certain way and made into something much more useful. And the relationships are a bit like that. We're putting together things that weren't together before. On the next slide, if you take another analogy, perhaps that we're more familiar with, if you take a piece of string and a couple of knitting needles, and you're clever enough to figure out how to wind that string in its own special way, you can create, again, all sorts of useful objects. The yarn doesn't change its state. It doesn't really change much about itself, but when it's put in a unique pattern, woven and knotted and connected in interesting ways, lots of interesting things can happen. On our major road trip we had this past summer, in the vehicle to keep everybody happy, and you don't want the ship, kind of generating any mutinous thoughts. My wife Michelle, she always has a craft for us to do in the van while we're traveling to help pass the time. And this year the craft was we all had to knit something. So she's very good at knitting, but I certainly am not, and the kids didn't really know much about knitting at all either. But we actually learned through trial and error and the difficult process of putting these needles and the string together in peculiar ways. We all had to go at making a scarf, and maybe about a month or so ago I finally finished my scarf, and perhaps someday you'll have a chance to see it. It's not all that elegant, but it was an interesting learning experiment about taking this very long piece of string, wrapped up in a ball, and turning it into something useful and interesting. I think it's important on this front to think about social network weaving and connecting. It's not about social engineering, which doesn't have a good reputation, rightly so. I think of it much more about a kind of relational crafting. So if we stick with the knitting or the weaving analogy, it's about just arranging what's there in some interesting and new ways. Another way of thinking about it is to consider it as an artistry of convening, bringing people together, bringing organizations together, bringing resources into new relationships so that something that wasn't possible before now becomes possible. So these are all things that undoubtedly you already know a great deal about, and this framework can help to enrich and extend that. When we think of the knitting or weaving in a social network context, here's a list of some different ways that it's expressed. So social network can sound a little technical and abstract, perhaps even somewhat computational, but this is what I mean when we think of social networks and connecting. So it might involve all kinds of different activities: meeting, organizing, planning, protesting, supporting, researching, playing, praying, learning, eating, building. All sorts of interactions we have with each other are driven by the network of connections that we have, and they're always changing. So a relationship between any two people is always changing, so are the numbers and types of people we might interact with. What we want to consider, though, is how the conceptual and the analytic ideas related to our study of networks can help us understand where we are, so get a better line of sight on our current context, and then help us to see other goals that we have in mind, or situations or cultural adjustments we might want to make, problems we're trying to solve, how that knowledge of those social networks can help us to better strategically invest the resources that we have. When you look at social elements, knitting involves string, weaving involves string or some other material. But when we talk about social networks, there's another really important element, and the important element that you can see here is a person. So the person is a little bit like the basic element in knitting. We have a person, and this human figure is going to be our basic element as I walk through an explanation of how some of these structural dynamics play themselves out. Although it's possible, it is quite rare that a human being is ever fully disconnected from other people. So all of us are in some kind of a different, or some kind of social structure. We have some sort of relationship to the people around us. And if you look at this image, you'll see that I've drawn some of these individual elements, these people. I've showed connections between them. And you can think of these, the sketch that I've made here on the slide, as three different kinds of social elements. So you can see in the one to the left, everybody knows that one person. So there's one person that they're all connected to, and that person knows them. But you can see that the three people around the bottom of that, they don't necessarily know each other. They just know that one person in the middle. If you look at the upper right set of figures, the first person knows the second knows the third, but the first person does not know that third person. They are not connected to each other except through that middle one. If that middle person suddenly leaves, those two people won't have any means of connecting with each other. And then the bottom is just a very, very simple one, which is two people that have some sort of mutual connection with each other. They, of course, each know each other. And if it's a connection of friendship, then we can see that the friendship goes both ways. Now, if we quiz people about who their friends are, what can awkwardly happen is that some people might say that one person's my friend, but they may not say the same in reverse. And so even in friendship networks, that arrow that I've got drawn there that goes both ways could actually be an arrow that only goes in one direction. So these are social fragments. These are parts of kind of basic parts of the networks that we're all part of, though none of them are quite as simple as this. In social network studies, we use dots and lines to represent people and relationships. The dots are often called nodes, and the lines are often called edges. So you won't typically see large network diagrams that have the little people I drew. We simplify those people down to really basic forms like dots or circles or little squares or some other geometric shape. The diagram, when you have two nodes and you draw something between them, that line's called an edge, and the edge indicates some kind of relationship between the two nodes. So they have a relationship, and we can say any number of things and say what that means, but it shows some kind of connection between those two nodes. This is, of course, extremely simplified. None of our relationships, none of our connections are this simple in any way. It's a very, very overly simplified way of taking the complex phenomena of human relationships and putting it into some understandable form. I think that's always important to keep in mind. Whatever network diagrams we generate, however we do our analysis, however sophisticated our analysis is, it is always a significant simplification of the actual reality of these connections and ties. But it's worth doing because it is useful, and it can help us through that simplification sometimes see things we can't in the cloud of other details that surrounds our interactions. This is a very famous diagram. This was written before computers were used. It's almost 100 years old, 1930s. And it's a famous social network diagram that at the time was called a sociogram. Jacob Moreno drew it by hand, and he generated this diagram by watching children interact on a playground. And what he did is he sat there, and at recesses and lunch hours, presumably he had permission to do so, although in the 1930s, one never knows. But Jacob Moreno was a researcher, and he watched to see who was friends with who played with whom on the playground, where were the interactions. And this is a 4th grade class, and it would be really interesting if we were all together with each other and we're having a conversation for me to ask you, what do you think this represents? What does this diagram represent? Who are the triangles and who are the circles? Well, let me say this. The triangles, if we said that the triangles and the circles represent the girls and the boys, you could make some general assumptions about the social dynamics of that neighborhood. What could we surmise? Well, you can see from the diagram that there are very few connections between the boys and the girls in the 4th grade playground. You can see actually only one brave connection between a circle and a triangle, between a boy and a girl in the playground. We have no idea what that represents. It could have been the boy's younger sister checking up on him. We don't know. But somebody crossed the Great Divide. The interesting thing is, if you looked at the playground as a casual passerby, you can't see these ties. The phenomena only becomes visible when somebody like Jacob Moreno sits there and looks at those ties and takes the invisible relational connection and starts to draw the connections on this kind of abstracted, simplified form. But when he's done that, it yields us something interesting. We have new information about what's there, and it would allow us to do some analysis on that. Now back to our scattered social fragments. If we're thinking about culture change, community leadership, our interest in tackling tough problems, and all of us have some stake in that somewhere along the line, of course we have to decide, do we leave things as they are and simply hope they will change over time? That's an option. Many people exercise that option by choosing just to do very little about what's around them. Others, however, have a stronger interest in actually trying to do something about what they see, either taking advantage of opportunities, helping people, perhaps introducing new ways of learning and thinking and doing things. And the premise today is that we have some interest in changing things, some idea in shifting culture, even if that culture is as small as an organization that's trying to adopt a new practice, or if it's as wide as changing a health pattern in the community. All of us are wanting to sort of shift things. And today's usefulness, looking at social networks, is to say, by thinking about these as having network dynamics, we may have another angle on looking at how we might actually bring about the change that we're considering. So let's look here at a somewhat simplified dynamic path to show how changing the structure of networks can lead to a change in outcomes and lead to a change in our practices and habits together. So here in the slide you'll see a whole bunch of blue squares that are connected by gray lines. So the nodes and edges here form a particular pattern. This looks a little bit like the first slide I showed you with the people, the social fragments. So we've got some clusters of people, or if they're not people, it could be clusters of organizations. And you can see that there's a couple of them that are larger, that have 5, 6 nodes, fairly well connected. We see 2 nodes that have no connections at all at the bottom. And then you see some other ones where they're just much simpler social fragments, just about as basic as you can get. So you can ask a few questions about this. What are we seeing? I could ask you how many groups are there, and you could quickly count this out and say, oh, just about a dozen. There's a kind of a good bunch of groups. I could say to you, which, if this is a group of, these are groups of people, I can say to you, which person has the most connections? And so you could look at every one of those dots, every node, and you could say, how many relations do they have? And you say, oh, there's one there that's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, there's another one's got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. You could count and find out who has the most connections. You could say who's the most central, who has the least connections. So all of these would allow us to do some analysis on this basic network. Now, if we want to shift things, and we're saying we're enacting change, if we imagine that these are people who, for whom we have a resource that they all need. So let's say that they are people who require new information about an important health risk that's facing the community. And we want to communicate that to them. We want to show them how that health risk is important to them. And we actually want, we need to bring them together to talk to them about it and explain some things and show some things to them. So what could be done to change these dynamics? Well, we could imagine that if we do nothing, they will stay as fragments. They aren't connected. There's no ties between them. But if we move forward and say, how can we change the dynamics, there's something quite simple. And you'll all know this by experience. We can start to connect these pieces together. And it begins in this way. Our social fragments, if we're the actor, and we start talking to each of these groups, and we encounter them, and we start making those connections, we will become a hub. So if you're the one that has this new information, they don't know each other, but you're going around and you're finding these disconnected hubs. The hub is the middle that connects to everyone else. So if we look at the next slide, you'll see that after we've gone about our work, contacting people, perhaps bringing them together, identifying what they, how they can benefit, why it's important, something has changed. We've made a structural change in the network, and a new dynamic has been introduced. We, as the hub, have become a broker of information, or we have become a relational broker. And now what can happen that couldn't happen before is that it's much easier, if the hub knows something, to let those around the group know what's going on. This is, of course, very useful. If you're disseminating information about an important health risk, you now have a means to actually let all these different groups know. If the hub wants to share something, it can reach all the fragments and all the people. You might imagine, though, that there are also some difficulties with this. What if, let's back up to this slide. If this isn't about a health hazard that you're wanting to communicate, but if, in fact, this person is someone who has the common cold, and these are all people they just happen to have met, we would say that now that common cold has a new pathway to reach all of the groups. So the hub and weaving that hub has both pros, if I want to communicate information, and it also has cons, which is if it's the spread of disease, then that hub person, whatever happens to that hub person, is now going to affect all of those groups that they're tied to. Now we can continue to change this network, and this is what typically happens when this hub at this early stage begins to mature and develop, and it starts to become more sophisticated. For instance, if the hub brought all of these social fragments together to have a lovely picnic in the park, what's going to happen? Well, they're not all going to connect through that hub anymore. That might have been the occasion for the meeting. But once everyone's together, we move to a new form. And that new form looks a little bit like this more complicated social network that's getting a little closer to how we actually operate. So this network is getting more complex. The hub is still there. You might still see that leader, that weaver person is still there. But now a bunch of other connections that don't go through that leader are starting to develop. In fact, we could say if you look at the hub and you take the hub out, it goes back to social fragments. But in this case, If you take out that leader weaver, you do decrease the connectability of that network, but it won't go back into fragments. There are many other alternative pathways. And so now for communicating information, has it become easier or more difficult? And I think if you looked at this diagram and you said, we need to make sure every node in the network knows what's happening, that in fact, it has become more difficult. So the network, from one vantage point, has become tougher, more resilient. It's harder to break it apart or to disconnect it. But at the other side of on the con side, communication has become more uneven. There is no single hub to go to. Even if the hub knows everything, there's some links that have been tied up and connected that don't run through that initial central hub that we now have to rely on. So we've changed the dynamic of the network, and it has advantages and disadvantages depending on what we're trying to do. We've increased resilience, but communication has become less efficient, and so it's got the pro-con side, and I think that's really critical as we're thinking about our own networks, even our institutional networks, that for that controlling element, it can be very helpful because we can disseminate something quickly and easily, but it can be difficult on the other hand because if I somehow forget to communicate something or decide I don't want to, then nobody gets to know about that. And so that kind of a brokering role begins to have a really important dynamic in that network. If this network continues to develop and gets even further along its pathway, we can see another type of structure that begins to emerge. As a network gets more interconnected internally and continues to make links outside of itself, we can see what network analysts and researchers would call a core periphery network. That's a bit of an unusual kind of name, a core periphery, but when you see the image, I think you'll get what it means. You can see that there is in the core periphery network, in the next slide, there's a blue middle part, and that blue middle part is very interconnected with itself. That's the core group. So if this is an organizational diagram, a diagram of organizational connections, that group is what we would see as probably the core operational group. It's the one that's performing many of the routine tasks. It's involved in a lot of the decisions. It's very much focused on that network's needs itself. Outside of that is a layer that is less connected. That's the periphery, people a little bit out of that. And this core periphery network has a couple of interesting features. One is that they tend to be, these are innovative networks. So when the network looks like this, it has a reasonably high degree of innovation, and it can do interesting things with novelty. These are also quite resilient. They're tough, and they're tough because if you could remove quite a few of those blue nodes, and the network would not fall apart. It would change some of its dynamics, but it would still function effectively. These are therefore quite adaptive. They can shift and change, and so there's a higher degree of flexibility. The downside is, so some of the challenges will be that communication can be very uneven. It's difficult to try to get everybody on the same page in this kind of a structure. It's less efficient, as we saw emerging from the previous slide. And there's a tension begins to develop between the core, which is very good at doing sort of the more routine, regular things, and the periphery, which is the source of novelty, new ideas. So in an organizational setting, the core would be perhaps the people that are on your executive team or in your core directing team, and they're very much preoccupied with what the organization needs to do. The green nodes could be the people that maybe are only in your meetings periodically, and they're connecting to a whole bunch of institutions, organizations, or places that you don't typically travel. So they become the source of new ideas, and the core is the means of actually operationalizing those, and that can bring along its own tensions in terms of what each of those groups wants. Again, remember, this is a very simplified kind of version of what of a much more complex social reality, but it can be a useful way of understanding some of the dynamics that we face. And it can also help us explain why is communication so difficult, or why do all these new ideas and novelties, why when they kind of get brought into the organization, do they get weeded out and do they get kind of put aside or squelched? Why is that going on? And these network dynamics can help us understand a little bit more about why that's the case. Or you can imagine that blue node middle part got bigger and bigger, and we had fewer and fewer green ones. Eventually, we become just a very self-preoccupied organization. We have very low innovation, very high interconnection, and if we're supposed to be innovative and we're not, that would help us to understand perhaps why that's the case. Here are a few things in the next, we'll back up. So just to re-summarize this cycle, you can see that in a simple sense, if we were working on addressing a social issue or a challenge or a question or an organizational dynamic, if we imagine that there is some process like this that could be followed where we go from social fragments to the development of a hub to a more mixed, emerging kind of a complex network that you see, eventually it can settle into a core periphery network where we have a whole very different range of dynamics than we had in the initial cluster of fragments. So networks, it's important to kind of look at two things that have been happening here in my descriptions. First of all, networks have structure. So we say networks have structure, they have shape. We see these. That's the images that we see. We see the nodes, we see the edges, and how those nodes and edges in connections form patterns. We can add nodes, drop nodes, add edges, drop edges. But networks also have a second feature, and that is they have dynamics. So no social network, no organizational network sits still like this. There's always something moving in between on those pathways, whether it's information, whether those are meetings, whether those are transfers of resources. There's always something going on, and that's the second feature of networks, which is they have dynamics. So if you think of those two parts, structures and dynamics, and that means that the nodes and edges are always they're always in motion on the dynamic side. Nodes can be added or dropped, dynamics can change, and these two realities make networks very complex very quickly. And it's interesting from an analytic standpoint that even our most powerful computing capabilities can quickly run out of resources when we try to fully analyze more realistic networks because of their high degree of complexity. It also perhaps reminds us that when we're working in some of these change settings, we can feel overwhelmed by the challenges at a leadership level with keeping tabs on everything that's going on and all the people and all the shifting dynamics. And when we see these networks, which are much more simplified and begin to get a sense of their complexity, I think it makes sense to us why at times it can be such a difficult challenge trying to bring these pieces together. We might ask ourselves a few questions. Again, if these nodes are not people, but now they're organizations or institutions, for example, various social service agencies in a community, what does this look like? Well, you can see from this, our simple diagram, if they're working kind of in silos, somebody forms some strategy around connecting them, that actually works. It begins to evolve towards a more complex interaction, and we could end up with a network ecosystem that has higher resilience and has improved dynamics, if that's what we're trying to work towards. The next slide is just I won't go spend too much time on this one. This slide is just about, if you imagine your city, your community, your neighborhood, where you're at, that's the bottom gray slide. And then if the next slide up is every single person that's part of that community, so it's no longer a map, it's all the humans there, kind of that next layer, and they all have various connections with each other. So let's say that's what that is. If we step one level above that, then if we said that's some sort of an organizational level, so there's a smaller subset of the whole population that's actually involved in some organizational connecting or in specific groups and clubs and clusters, there's that one. And then if we said, well, what about the very largest and most like bureaucratic or the largest organized structures of our societies, like maybe large government structures, large corporate structures? They're a much smaller subset. Again, there's fewer of them, but they're much larger. And so that's just another way of saying that within our communities, there's a lot of different aspects of our, what we call our social infrastructure. There's these structures and connections that we have that every person is involved with in some way or other, and yet each of us in different ways contributes to them and makes them very, at times, difficult to understand, given, again, the structure and the dynamics that happen in those places. So this is just highly simplified, but it just gives us a kind of visual element to help orient ourselves within that landscape. Let me offer a couple of resources here that may be of use to you. There's two. So June Hawley's got this book. The blue covered one on the right is the full version, Network Weaver Handbook. And it's about 350 pages, 8.5 by 11. It's quite a long book, but it's got lots of useful, it's got diagrams, case studies, explanations in it. And then the smaller one on the left is just a shortened version of that. And you'll see that in the resource list at the end. if this kind of way of thinking about things and this strategic angles of interest to you, this is a useful way to go. There's lots of resources on networks that you'll see at the end, but this in particular has been helpful for a lot of people in trying to understand the linkage between networks and community organizing, community development, and local culture change. Okay, a few more resources here. First of all, this is, again, remember you're going to take this presentation, you're going to be able to give it back to your team or into your circle and say, hey, here's a useful tool for us to use. And just to review again, we have fragments, we have the hub that can be developed out of that to begin to change the structure. Then we might have multiple hubs or an increasingly complex network that can, over time, develop into a core periphery network. If you think about this as on the organizational landscape side, you can see how some sectors of the community, maybe your sports clubs and things like that, you might say, oh, they're kind of the multiple hub phase. They're all very interconnected. They have a lot to do with each other. You might look at another sector, as I mentioned earlier, and say, well, but what about our social service providers? What do they look like? You know, is it fragmented? Does it look like this core periphery? Like, where would we place them on this kind of a rough scale? And is that where we'd like them to be? Is that a good strategy? Educational institutions, we could do the same. In large organizations, you could do a similar kind of analysis around departments or different business units that may have different relationships with each other and ask, should we change it? Is it good the way it is? Is it doing what it needs to do? So that's the usefulness of it. Let's take a look here at the worksheet section. So the worksheets are developed. I've taken some of the ideas from June Hawley's book and then just sort of reworked them and I think simplified them in some sense and clarified some of their different components. So the first sheet that we have is the Network Analysis Concepts worksheet, and it's just a two-sided worksheet that will be available after the webinar. And it basically kind of just walks you through if you wanted to understand how the shape of a network changes the dynamic. So it's just very simple. It kind of allows you to take a look at what's there, introduce some of the concepts that you'll be working, that you might want to work with and think through. And it has a sets of questions about how each of these networks has pros and cons. So it's not like that sort of string network, that bead of, or a string of beads you see. Sometimes that's very useful, and sometimes that's not very useful. And same with the fully connected network at the top. Sometimes that's great, and sometimes it's not. It just depends what you need to do. So what I've done is simplify the kind of pros and cons, benefits, and the advantages and disadvantages of each of these different network forms to give you some sense of a tool that you can use to analyze the kinds of networks you might be looking at. The next sheet, the Practice Analyzing a Map worksheet. One more. There we are. This worksheet gives you a chance to apply what you've been doing. So you can actually go through the questions. I've provided a kind of interesting network there as a diagram. And then it asks a series of questions to kind of get us into the habit of thinking like, okay, where's the most connected node? Or if I wanted to create two groups out of this one rather messy group, what's the simplest way to do that? It asks you questions about, is there a core somewhere? Are there multiple cores? Is there a hub? Can you find a hub? What's the most connected one? Those sorts of questions. So it's a useful way of doing that. And on the other side of it, you'll see a different network again where I ask some other kinds of questions that you can actually write on the sheet. You can kind of circle stuff or color it or use it just to kind of give you some hands-on practice with actually taking a look at this mode of analyzing social structures. The last worksheet, Sketching Your Network, is a case where if you had in mind an organization or a community dynamic or a project you're working on, and you could actually start by saying, going through this, to kind of give you a step-by-step process to go through to begin to bring that network to light. How do you describe it? How do you begin to put it down in some form that you can actually see? And you'll see the reference there to June Hawley's original worksheet on that. One of the examples I have of this is that you don't have to have a computational you don't have to think computers, you don't have to think highly complex to make use of it. This was the FCM 2015, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities trade show in Edmonton this past year that I was at, and I was talking about the social structures of cities, and so I had these buildings I built, you can see in the first image at the back, and then I just used Smarties and a marker on the table, to show that, actually what we're interested in is exploring the social infrastructure of cities, and that's the people, the smarties, connecting with each other. And so that had nothing to do with anything sophisticated or computational. I just kind of created this network, and then as people walked by, it generated a lot of conversations about, what does your community look like? Is it disconnected? Are there fragments? Are there hubs? Are there nodes? Or within your local government, how does this work? And so whatever level the person stopping by was at, it was a conversation starter. So I think that's important, that we can use sticky notes and pieces of paper to begin to analyze networks. We don't have to immediately jump to highly complex data sets, although computation is useful because it lets us analyze big data sets we could never do with our own human brains. They're just not able to capture that much information. I won't go over them, but there's a resource, free links and resource page here. I've tried to make all of the things that are there either free or very low cost, and really emphasizing free resources so that you're able to pick this up and experiment with it, try it out, play with it, see if it seems to be useful or not, without having to make too significant a commitment. If there's anything here that you see, I, of course, would be happy to hear from you. You can send me a note or get in touch and provide some help that way. And then I think there's also going to be a PDF of some extra slides. These are things that I found really interesting of other people's work on networks, including artists and designers who've used networks in some really interesting visual ways. And I hope, if in a certain sense, that these things capture your imagination, because that's a really, I think, one of the most interesting part of networks is their sort of creative and inspirational possibility to help us see what we don't typically see. So I'm happy to take some questions if we're at that point.
Thank you so much, Milton. I think you've done a terrific job of both kind of giving us a taste of the theory and the purpose, but also some real practical ways in which we can begin to kind of put it into action. I am eager to hear. Are there questions that have been popping up, Christy, that you can bring forward?
I haven't received any questions yet, but I would love for people to use the question box to send questions, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask Milton yourself.
I have a question while we're sort of waiting. So when you, so I can understand and appreciate, like if I were working on a community project, taking the time to sort of map the current sort of social network would be really useful, might help me identify, where there are people in the community that would be highly leveraged, those hub people or the weaver people, to really kind of connect with and build rapport with. But are there other ways that you've really incorporated, like once you've mapped it and you see those dynamics and you've you've sort of mapped it out to see visually, are there other ways in which you've used the insights generated from the work to influence how you move forward?
Well, I think we often see organizational information, presented to us in sort of listed forms, groups, organizations, even members and participants. You see directories, all of that. Usually it's listed, it's sort of listed in that sort of linear form. And it's a little bit like how stats can, census data is collected. We know lots of things about individual people. So we have these lists of sort of things attached to each node. And I think what's missing is often any real sort of structural maps of what the connections across those things look like. So let me give you an example. In a community, we took a look here in Hamilton, for instance, at the charitable organizations. And if you fill out a T3010 form as a registered charity, then you have to, you list your boards of directors and things like that. And one of the things you could do is say, in a given community, how many people serve on multiple boards? In other words, do we have a community that's highly, like a lot of the same people, serving in those roles? So what does that look like? Those interlocking directorates. So this is done at business levels, in corporations, but you can also think about this at the nonprofit or charitable level. And you might ask yourself, is it advantageous, for instance, if we have a relatively low number of people that are serving a relatively high number of organizations? Well, sure, at one level that's useful because there's a lot of transfer of information, there's an awareness, and a kind of cross-pollinating. But in one study in the U.S., what they discovered was communities that had too much interconnection and interlocking linkages in that way, actually, when external stress and crisis came to the community, they had very low innovation scores. So they weren't actually able to adapt well to the change that was occurring. And you think, well, that's weird. Like, if they know each other so well and they're such a tight group, surely that group will respond better to change. And what network sort of, looking at it from that network vantage point, what we learn is actually they didn't have enough external ties to novelty, to new ideas. They weren't porous enough. They weren't open enough. And so under stress, what they tended to do is just consolidate what they know. They just sort of, they just get better and push harder on what they already know. You can see this in organizations under stress. They often fail to kind of innovate because in a stress state, they just kind of fall back to what they know. And if what they know is a very sort of small and tight circle, it tends to just, it gets tighter. And so rather than a solution that could actually lead you to kind of adapt to a change and reimagine something new or adjust to it, by looking at the social structural side and seeing that you could begin to ask yourself, you know, how, you know, are we going to be able to respond well to change if it should happen? And again, they each have pros and cons. The tightly knit community can get things done. Things it knows, it can get done. But if it's in a period where it has to begin to change what it knows and introduce new ideas, you can find that it's less able to do so. And it doesn't have enough, the periphery is too small, too weak, and the operational core is too entrenched, and it can't actually absorb much new, very much in the way of new ideas and new approaches. And that's true at all scales. So it doesn't have to be large. It could happen not just a city scale, but it could even happen within an organization where you just don't have sufficient, you know, variance coming in. And so you think you're getting better and better, but you're actually kind of migrating further and further away from long-term solutions.
That's really helpful, because what it introduces then is another important sort of factor to pay attention to. So it is about the connection between the different people or organizations, the density of those connections and who's connected to who. But then you can also look at it around new ideas and innovation and where does, because that ultimately will keep that system from becoming really brittle. Or,
and that's,
you know,
that's why that sheet in particular, the network analyst, you know, analysis concepts is really important. And I show those shapes, and then I say there's pros and cons. So it's not, there's not like, hey, one particular form is like that's what we're all aspiring to. It's like, no, not necessarily. It depends what needs to happen. So if you have a very well-known process, like you're building cars on an assembly line, you want a hard operational core that's extremely good at refining that, right? Getting better and better and saving seconds here and saving, you know, that's an optimization kind of space, right? We just get better and better at doing this one thing we know. The problem is if the auto industry is going away and flying cars are now coming into business and you're not noticing that, one day all of a sudden the kinds of vehicles you're making could be obsolete and you're done radically fast. You know, just all of a sudden, you know, you can't adapt quick enough to get back into the change that's happening. So that's where the core periphery would have a greater advantage.
Okay. But so, that makes really good sense.
Yeah, so it's just a case of, I think sometimes people default and say, oh, this is an innovation network, we should all be like innovation networks. It's like, well, it just depends what you need to do. Like, you really have to kind of think about how the different structures yield different sort of, you know, characteristics for people or for groups or networks of organizations.
I'm just going to check in. Christy, anything new to any new pieces to sort of bring forward? I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
I have a question here from Mark Woolley in Peterborough, Ontario. His question is, has there been any work done on capturing the multiple relationships between nodes? For instance, a person might be a volunteer, a board member for a limited time, and a financial supporter for the same organization. Seems like 3 relationships between 2 nodes.
Yeah, great question. And yes, I mean, it's looked at in terms of that being a challenge because so many, you know, if you draw a circle, and that's a person, and you draw another circle, and then you draw a line between them, imagine that's a mother and a daughter. And if you said, how would we fully summarize any one person's life? So can we fully explain the mother's life? Well, no, we could write, you know, stacks of books and not exhaust it, right? So just one node on its own it's got all kinds of possibilities. Same with the other node, and then you can say, well, what could travel on that relationship between them? You can say, well, what is there between a mother and a daughter? It could be a massive amount of kind of information, all sorts of things that we can't possibly capture. So I think it's a great question, but what's probably most useful from a practical standpoint is we often have to limit what the node represents and what's going to traffic between them. So I think it's important to recognize we can never fully capture it. That's why my warnings kind of early on to say these are highly simplified. So they can be useful, but the diagrams have to be kind of used, I would say, with a sense of care because of this very point. What can move between them is so significant. From a more analytic standpoint, the number of variables we can put on the edge between two nodes is actually quite limited, especially if we have a network of any size. It gets complex incredibly fast, and some of those become non-computational problems. You just can't calculate. It's too much. So a better strategy is to sort of think about, well, what phenomena do I want to capture? So I could do 2 people and put a lot of things on that edge to try to fully capture it. I could do 10 people with 2 or 3 characteristics, or I could do 100 people maybe just with 1 characteristic, like their volunteer activity or something like that. So it's a continuous process of making choices, a little bit like selecting a lens for a camera. Like what do I want to see? I want to see something far away, something close. What feature? Am I going to have an infrared camera? I want to see heat. Am I going to have this? We kind of make choices about what we want to see, and this is a tool, so we have to sort of choose to say, what is it I'm trying to what am I trying to understand, and then recognize the limit in doing that. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's my best crack at that for now.
Thank you. Is there another question there, Christy, or a follow-up?
I'll give Mark a few minutes. Oh, he writes, thanks.
Because certainly, I mean, one of the things that your response kind of really surfaced in me then is, like any project, right, there's a scoping piece that you have to do, because, there are multiple ways you could come at resolving something. There's multiple ways you could map something. So it really is, there's a real rigor, right, that you have to put to, well, what is it that would be most helpful for me in terms of moving this forward?
An example I have is I was in a meeting one time in a city in Canada with some of the kind of the leading nonprofit sector, some city officials, some business people, and there was one group in particular that said, "Oh, hey, we're doing." They were a community group saying, "Listen, we're doing X, Y, and Z. Like we've been at this for a long time. We're doing great with this." And one of the city staff said, "I'm actually interested in the area, and I've been here for a long time, 15 years or more, and I've never heard of you." So that had nothing to do with networks in a formal sense, but my immediate trigger is, all right, so even this group thinks everyone knows or is connected with what they're doing, and over here is what should be a very relevant player. But if you actually mapped those networks, or if you started looking at those connections, you'd see that there's a fragment there. There's an important miss across that channel. And you could see that in that meeting. What happened was they were actually able to connect. So he says, "I've never heard about you," and the other person's like, "Well, that seems odd." And it's like, "Well, why haven't I heard about you?" And then they had so then the relationship is forged, and it could be that those two then become an important connector across that gap. And now what's happened is through 2 people in the right organizational position, you're working at bringing 2 networks together. So it's not just about the 2 people anymore. It could be a case of, well, we need to meet, or our teams need to meet, or we need to do a project together, or whatever. Like something transpires now on that tie between the 2 of them. But in my mind, as a conceptual tool, I can sort of see that, okay, there's a hole in this network. There's a hole right here. Like I didn't know it was there, but as we're talking, it became obvious. There's a hole here. So we may actually, if we want to increase capacity in that space, we're going to have to do something to weave across that.
Well, and it really illustrates the point you made theoretically that, these networks are always dynamic.
Yeah.
And that, as an actor in a system, we can choose to influence that in some way by the kinds of connections that we make.
Sure. And back to Mark's question is, if you think about, well, which perspective to take. So someone making use of social services of various kinds in some cities, they're dealing with a whole bunch of different agencies. Those agencies may or may not be connecting with each other. The individual is connecting with all of them. So in that case, the individual, in a sense, becomes like the hub. And they're connecting with all these different agencies and groups, each kind of having on their own at their own level, but there's no coordination across them. Now, maybe that's useful. So again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but looked at from that vantage point, the individual could certainly identify what appears to be that they're dealing with a very fragmented system. And we often hear this used in the language of silos. You know, it's like this group doesn't know what this group's doing. I fill out forms for this group, and now I got to go fill out seems like the same form over here, and you know, and then I go over this other one, and now they want something different. And so the individual can experience, you know, people might say, oh, this is the public sector, this is the social service sector. You know, it kind of sounds like it's all together, but the individual experience can be very different, which is it's very fragmented. Like even if they're joined on paper, you know, I'm hitting them each in a kind of unique and distinct way, and it feels very fragmented. So, so just to add to the complexity of the landscape is that, you know, the vantage point you choose also has a significant effect on how you view what's going on.
Very, very interesting. Any other comments or questions that you're receiving there, Christy?
I do have a follow-up from Mark again. He says, always tending toward increased complexity. I see the nodes described include individuals, groups of people, and formal organizations. What about even less people things that serve to create relationships, such as events and shared assets? An event may link people and organizations that would otherwise not connect and may eventually lead to direct relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Some work has been done from the planning side on, for instance, spatial networks. So, for instance, looking at networks of streets and roads, and that include things like public spaces where people might, you know, where interactions higher. Third places, you know, coffee shops or, you know, stores or bars or gathering spots like that. So absolutely, events. I mean, really, anything can go on those nodes and edges. Anything that has any relational kind of linkage, which is, I mean, you can put numbers. You can do network analysis on, you know, food webs at a biological level. You can do it for metabolic networks in a cell. So network science is used to analyze how proteins move around in cells, and even a single cell is, it's incredibly complex. There's a worm that they do neural network mapping on C. elegans, and you know, it's got just north of 300 nodes, and it's an incredibly complex network. They're trying to figure out how the thing works, and you know, that's 300 neurons, and we've got trillions of them. So yeah, you can put what you need into them, and I think that's probably what's useful. I've focused, just to keep it more clear, kind of on people, organizations from a community development standpoint, but yeah, absolutely. You can put all kinds of things on those nodes and edges, and people do textual analysis, for instance, on like Victor Hugo novels, Les Mis. You can go online and find a network diagram of Les Mis characters, how they connect with each other, so, or words in a text by occurrence, by position. So, yep, all kinds of stuff can be put on those nodes and edges.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Milton, for introducing us to just giving us a quick taste for network mapping. I sure am curious and eager to play with this a bit more and develop my skill around it. And I really appreciate, you know, the modeling and thinking you gave us around not just how to do it, but how to make sense and utilize the information that it generates. So thank you so much for that.
Well, my pleasure.
I do
Thank
want
you for the
to.
invite.
You know, it's funny, as I was sort of thinking about this and listening to your presentation, I was really kind of called to remember this Meg Wheatley quote, where she reminds us that the world doesn't change one person at a time, but it changes as networks of relationships form among people who discover that they share a common cause and vision of what's possible. And for me, what I really, really loved was that you helped to make those critical connections really, really visible. And then we can work with them much more strategically.
We can, and because they're invisible, like they are largely invisible, what comes from them isn't invisible, but the connections often are. And so sometimes they're overlooked because of that. We don't fully appreciate what's going on because they're just not easy to see.
Well, I'm excited because now we have simple ways of beginning to at least map those out and make them visible. And then we can, you know, new opportunities to utilize that comes forward. So I do want to share with folks as well that our next big Tamarack Learning event is happening in Edmonton, Alberta, November 24th to 26th. Community Engagement, the Next Generation. You'll see a link down there if you want to learn more and find out how you can register. And I think, is that our last slide, or if we could maybe move to the final one? So this just highlights for you again some different ways to stay connected with us and some of the ideas and thinking that we are helping to profile and share with each other. And we'd love to have you continue to join us and learn alongside us in lots of different ways. So thank you so much, everyone. We welcome your feedback on the webinar. There's the email address to submit feedback, any ideas as well for future webinars, we'd welcome. And as Christy said, thanks. In the next few days, you should receive from us an email that provides the links, the worksheets that Milton shared, and some other resources so that you can take these ideas and play with them. And by all means, circle back as you play. Let us know what you're learning, what you're discovering, and how you're putting this knowledge into work. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you.